60 years ago on a battleship in the Atlantic, Winston Churchill had chosen Onward Christian Soldiers for the service that marked his first meeting with President Roosevelt. Roosevelt was to bring America into the war 4 months later, a decision Churchill had long sought from him. Churchill had devoted himself single-mindedly to wooing the president, and since then the personal ties between the leaders of the two countries have been at the heart of what Churchill called the special relationship. The rows have most often come about the use of military force. Ironically, it was Churchill's deputy Anthony Eden who was to learn a painful lesson when he became Prime Minister and sought to go it alone during the Suez Crisis of 1956.
There seemed to have been a determination on Eden's part almost to push the Americans out of the picture, because they would be inconvenient, they would make it more difficult, they would complicate things, and you could get away with pushing them out of the picture.
Eden had conspired with the French and the Israelis on a plan to seize back the Suez Canal from the Egyptians. He'd prepared for war in total secrecy, with the Americans deliberately kept in the dark. As British troops went into Suez, the American President General Eisenhower realized he'd been totally deceived by Eden.
Rarely, I think, has one ever seen an American president so visibly angry as was Eisenhower in those days immediately following Suez.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. As it is the manifest right of any of these nations to take such decisions and actions, it is likewise our right, if our judgment so dictates, to dissent. We believe these actions to have been taken in error, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes.
Eisenhower pulled the plug on Suez by pressuring Eden and withdrawing American support for the pound. An abject Eden had been forced to resign.
It's the greatest single rupture in the special relationship in the post-war years. Thereafter, you don't do anything serious in the world as Brits unless the Americans at the very least acquiesce. Did change everything in that sense.
To help restore relations with America, Eden's successor, Harold Macmillan, invited Eisenhower to London. The two men were old friends. Macmillan had served on General Eisenhower's staff during the war, and now he laid on a reception for the president that would have made Alistair Campbell glow with pride.
He came on a visit to London, which was shortly before a general election. My grandfather used the visit absolutely shamelessly as part of his election campaign. And my grandfather managed to acquire a white open Rolls-Royce, which they borrowed for the occasion.
So, without delay, the procession begins. You'll see the temporary number plate tactfully put on the car, which is not its real one, USA 1.
And then my grandfather was driven through London with himself and the president sitting in the back of this white open Rolls-Royce, waving to the crowds, and of course ensuring that the proper coverage in the newspapers.
Macmillan won the election. But the following year there was a new president. The glamorous young John F. Kennedy looked to have little in common with the patrician old Etonian Prime Minister. But as it turned out, Macmillan had known Kennedy before the war. Kennedy had been a young man about town in London, where his father Joe had been sent as the American ambassador. And the fact that the Kennedy and Macmillan families were also related by marriage further helped the two leaders to bond.
The relationship was based not on mutual experience, but almost being part of the same social set, same family, same background. So when Jack appeared on the scene and was clear he was getting present, for my grandfather it was great because he had this strong connection already.
From the first, Macmillan's old world charm seemed to work on the young president. Each admired the other's style. It was famously said at the time that Britain had lost an empire and not yet found a role. But the Prime Minister now believed he could be the President's candid friend at a time of crisis. In 1962, Kennedy came into direct confrontation with the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev had secretly shipped nuclear missiles to communist Cuba that was just 90 miles from the US coast. Now, for the first time, America was in direct range of Soviet nuclear missiles, and the world was on the brink of war.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction.
Kennedy blockaded Cuba and demanded that Khrushchev remove his missiles or face war. As the crisis worsened, the president would regularly ring Macmillan. Kennedy said he wanted to share his loneliness as president with a leader of another nuclear power who he could both trust and who spoke English.
The relationship is hugely unequal. Of course, it's totally asymmetrical in real terms, and must never forget that. But it's still quite remarkable that the American president, in the middle of this absolutely absorbing crisis with all the pressures on him, should spend that much time on the phone to the British Prime Minister, sitting in Admiralty House, urging caution and being a chum.
The president came to see Macmillan after Khrushchev had backed down over Cuba. At the Prime Minister's country house, the two leaders discussed tactics for trying to persuade the Russians to sign a treaty banning nuclear tests. Macmillan was never to forget their meeting.
Lovely day like today in June, before the leaf had fallen. He'd gone. A most brutal and terrible act, which was as great a loss to the world as it was to the people of the United States.
Over the next 15 years, a series of odd couples in the White House and Number 10 would put great strain on the special relationship. In 1964, Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, known as LBJ, welcomed the new Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. Britain was in economic crisis, and Wilson was dependent on American support for the pound.
We come here, Mr. President, to express the firm determination of Her Majesty's government to do all in our power to strengthen our alliance and to make it more effective.
President Johnson was a 6'6" Texan who looked down on the Labour leader.
As they will be encouraged.
I don't think Johnson ever took to Wilson. Wilson was intellectual and a socialist. There hasn't been a socialist in Texas in 2 centuries. Pipe smoking, little disheveled, all of that, And I think Johnson found him kind of weaselly.
In Johnson's mind, Wilson was at his weaseliest when it came to supporting him over the escalating war in Vietnam.
I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division and certain other forces which will raise our fighting strength from 75,000 to 125,000 men almost immediately.
Johnson had ordered Operation Rolling Thunder in Vietnam. He claimed he was halting the spread of communism in Asia. Anti-Vietnam War protesters in London called on Wilson to condemn Johnson's policy.
Of course I disagree with the war. I think it's one of the most murderous wars in history. If I thought that we were more likely to end that war by one day by dissociating from President Johnson's policy, I would do it. I do not believe that is the case.
Although Wilson was lampooned as LBJ's lickspittle, he confided to a colleague, "You can't kick your creditor in the balls." But in the White House, an increasingly beleaguered LBJ now wanted more from America's closest ally. In the graphic phrase of one of his ministers, The Texan president wanted Wilson to pay the blood price of the special relationship by sending British troops to Vietnam.
The Vietnam War was a catastrophe. Wilson very wisely refused to go along with what Johnson wanted. The really important thing was it shows a British Prime Minister can take a stand if he wishes to do so. Wilson did, and he was right.
By 1970, there were two new men at the top, Richard Nixon and Ted Heath. The president hoped for great things from his fellow Conservative. Yet to Nixon's chagrin, Heath felt Britain's destiny lay not with America, but in Europe.
One of the rockier periods of the special relationship was in Ted Heath's time as Prime Minister. And that stemmed essentially from his absolute determination to give priority to getting Britain into the European community as it then was, and not wanting to give the French the excuse of seeing Britain as a Trojan horse whose first loyalty was to the United States. And therefore, the Americans came to feel that they were a lower priority for Britain than they had been in the past.
I would put it very briefly in this way. As Britain goes into Europe, there will be a new Europe. The United States is, at the present time, embarked on creating what is really a new America.
I think also after 1972, Ted Heath thought that President Nixon's troubles made him a ever less attractive partner.
For Ted Heath, it seemed, the special relationship was not worth the paper it wasn't written on. But by the start of the 80s, American Secret Service men were zealously guarding a new president. He and the new Prime Minister both felt they could bring the magic back into the relationship. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were political soulmates. Both were fervent anti-communists and free marketeers. The former Hollywood actor and the grocer's daughter were now embarked on a true-life political romance.
We in Britain think you are a wonderful president. We see so many things in the same way. We share so many of the same goals and a determination to achieve them, which you summed up so well, and alas, I cannot imitate this wonderful American English accent. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Based on the career that I once had before this one, you are a very tough act to follow.
It was a shared philosophy, which he understood from the very beginning. And for an American conservative to find someone like Margaret Thatcher who was agreed with him in his philosophy, but was also articulate and strong, he saw from the very beginning of his presidency that this was somebody that was going to help him.
The Argentine invasion of the Falklands in 1982 was to put the Thatcher-Reagan relationship under great strain. As the token force of British Marines surrendered, Mrs. Thatcher feared for her political survival and turned for help to her great friend, Ronald Reagan. But at first, he felt he had to be scrupulously neutral between Britain and a country in America's own backyard.
It's a very difficult situation for the United States because we're friends with both of the countries engaged in this dispute. And we stand ready to do anything we can to help them, and what we hope for and would like to help in doing is have a peaceful resolution of this.
The Argentine Air Force were launching deadly attacks on the British task force. The ships that Mrs. Thatcher had hurriedly dispatched to the South Atlantic lacked sophisticated air defenses. In Downing Street, the Prime Minister's repeated pleas to the President to end his neutral stance and help America's closest ally had become ever more urgent.
I think once he did understand how important it was to her, and once he accepted her argument that this was aggression and mustn't be allowed to go unchallenged, then the orders were given and we plunged into this with everything we had. I signed dozens of authorizations for drawdowns of equipment that the United States alone was in a position to supply in the very short time frame of that conflict.
RAF Harriers were now armed with state-of-the-art American missiles. And the Americans supplied satellite and other intelligence that revealed Argentine military plans.
Do you think we would have been able to win the Falklands without the assistance that we got from the Americans?
Well, my judgment would be no, but I'm not a military man.
At the presidential retreat of Camp David, Reagan had put the initial bumpiness with Margaret Thatcher over the Falklands behind him. The liaison between the two ideological soulmates was now stronger than ever. The two leaders were united in their implacable opposition to what Reagan called the evil empire of Soviet communism. But now, as the empire seemed to be imploding, they identified a new bogeyman on the world stage, the Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi. The Americans accused Gaddafi of sponsoring and spreading international terrorism. Reagan wanted to bomb Libya, but much of Europe refused to let him use its airspace or American bases on its soil. Margaret Thatcher took a different line.
It had the effect of cementing the Anglo-American alliance. There's another point. What's the good of having bases if when you want to use them, you're not allowed to by the home country? It made America realize that Britain was her real and true friend when they were hard up against it and wanted something, and that no one else in Europe was. They're a weak lot, some of them in Europe, you know. Weak, feeble.
American military power was once again on display in the Middle East 4 years later as the Sixth Fleet sailed to the Gulf. The target was now another Arab strongman. The Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and the West warned Saddam that if he didn't withdraw his troops, he faced war. Leading the coalition against Iraq was a new American president with a new British Prime Minister as his junior partner. John Major had arrived in a fog-bound Washington to discuss the plans for war with President George Bush Sr.
I remember very well John Major coming right after he assumed the prime ministership. The weather was bad. I got into the big limousine with him. We rode up the mountain to Camp David, and during that ride I told him what our plans were in terms of fighting Iraq if our private diplomacy failed, or if the United Nations effort failed. I told him when we were going to go to war and what we had to do, and asked, of course, for his support. He never wavered. He never felt, well, let me get back to you, I've got to go talk to the cabinet. He said, we are with you. And I've never forgotten that. His word of honor was solid gold, just as good as it could be.
When George Bush and I first met on the very eve of the Gulf War, clearly the largest single contribution to the Gulf War was going to come from the United States, though Britain was the second largest contribution. At no stage were we made to feel the junior partner in that. Everything was shared with us immediately, openly, spontaneously. When I've had those first meetings with George Bush and with his senior advisors and senior military men, I was frankly astonished at the extent to which everything was laid open on the table. Now that didn't just happen because George Bush and I happened to get on. It's a product of a very long-standing relationship between the two countries.
Though Saddam had suffered the mother of all defeats, he remained in power, unfinished business that George Bush the younger would inherit. But in 1992, Bush the elder was seeking re-election as a victorious war leader. He wanted to contrast his patriotic record of distinguished military service with that of his Democratic opponent. Bill Clinton had avoided the draft. He'd been a student at Oxford in the 60s, and the Bush campaign asked the Home Office in London for any material it held on Clinton.
It was a desperate attempt to smear Clinton, find something that they could, some rabbit they could pull out of the hat. And Major was willing to have the Home Office involved in this. Never before had a prime minister attempted to interfere directly in the internal affairs of the United States, in its politics, in its election, in its campaign, was a terrible blunder on Major's part.
Complete and utter nonsense. Didn't happen. There was no such agreement from the British government. If some individual had approached the Home Office, it certainly wasn't done with my consent as leader of the Conservative Party, with my consent as Prime Minister. Absolutely and categorically not.
Tony Blair's relationship with President Clinton was to be very different. Blair had applied Clinton's election-winning techniques to New Labour. And when the president hobbled into number 10 on a mysteriously injured leg, the two men were described as so close that they were like twins who'd been separated at birth.
I obviously had a great interest in Tony Blair because he had shown such interest in what I had done and in developing what has now become known as the Third Way. I think we tend to see the world in the same way, and we confronted many of the same political challenges when we started.
We worked closely together at a personal and a political level. We shared the same centre-left progressive politics. I mean, New Democrats, New Labour were, if you like, very much out of the same womb politically.
You had sexual relations with the president?
The Monica Lewinsky affair was on top of the political agenda when Tony Blair came on a return visit to a stormy Washington, 9 months after the sunny scenes with Clinton at number 10. The president was now fighting for his political life.
February '98 was when Tony Blair paid his official visit to Washington, or state visit, if you like. And that was only a few weeks, 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, whatever it was, after the Lewinsky business sort of blew up. And of course, the Prime Minister and the President had to go out together and do a joint press conference in the White House. And we all knew that the Lewinsky question would come to Tony Blair.
Could I ask the Prime Minister, you could have come here and simply talked about serious politics, but some people have been struck by the warmth of the personal statements of support that you've given to the President. Could I ask you, I mean, have you ever considered that that might be a politically risky strategy? And could I ask the President, have you appreciated those comments from Mr. Blair?
You know, to be quite honest, Phil, I mean, I've said it because I've believed it and because I think it is the right thing to do. And I've worked with President Clinton now for some 9 months as British Prime Minister. I have found him throughout someone I could trust, someone I could rely upon, someone I am proud to call, not just a colleague, but a friend.
You asked, do I appreciate it? No, He should have come here and jumped all over me. I mean, it's...
Blair could not have been more supportive of the president at that moment. And it was very important politically.
It was enormously appreciated, no doubt about it.
But the Mutual Admiration Society was to come under great strain in the following year over the crisis in Kosovo. Milosevic's ethnic cleansing spurred the West into action. NATO agreed it would bomb the Serbs. But Blair wanted a reluctant Clinton to commit to the use of ground troops. After Blair's frustrations were leaked to the press, a testy Clinton phoned him to remind him who was boss.
It did get heated from time to time, mainly because, as ever, some of this stuff got into the newspapers. And I think the testy conversation to which you refer had been prompted as much as anything by the Americans reading stuff in the press. And I think this is what made the conversation that one conversation more heated than usual.
I was an instigator and proselytizer for the action we took in Kosovo. America went into Kosovo. 85% of the assets, military assets, were American. They're placed thousands of miles away from America, on the doorstep of Europe, with Europe not capable, I'm afraid, of doing the whole thing militarily itself. Now, would we have been able to do that without that relationship with America? I think it would have been a lot tougher for America to justify it to its own people. I think it was tough enough for Bill Clinton at the time anyway.
But how would Blair get on with the new president? The hardline political views of the Texan George W. Bush seemed a million miles removed from the touchy-feely third-way style of Bill Clinton.
It was always said prior to George W. Bush becoming president that Tony Blair was thick with Bill Clinton. Well, fine. Bill Clinton was president of the United States, and he, of course, would have a good relationship with Tony Blair. But if it was built on philosophy, Prime Minister Blair set that down and decided to work closely with the president, and the president felt that he wanted to work very closely with Tony Blair.
The Prime Minister had flown to Camp David early in 2001 to meet the new president.
Tony Blair moved very quickly to establish a good working relationship with President Bush. I mean, they're two very, very pragmatic men. I remember Camp David meeting. They'd never met before. Got out of our suits, put on our chinos, and went in to have lunch. And the president said, "Welcome. Right, what should we do first? Iraq? Iraq." Vroom. And off we went. And no nonsense, no frills, friendly, practical. Very good. I was very encouraged.
A question for both of you. There's been a lot said about how different you are as people. Have you already in your talks found something maybe that some personal interest that you have in common, maybe in religion or sport or music?
Well, we both use Colgate toothpaste.
They're going to wonder how you know that, George. Yeah, the really alarming thing about that was that it happened to be true, because I went back and checked the toothpaste afterwards. Yes, it was, but I don't know.
In the first months after Camp David, there was little evidence that the Bush-Blair relationship had a genuine ring of confidence to it. But then came the events of Savage September.
It's at moments like that that the instinctive reaction, which is to come together in total solidarity, that is actually the best and most eloquent expression of the fact that there is a special relationship.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
America has no truer friend than Great Britain. Once again, we are joined together in a great cause. So honored the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity with America. Thank you for coming, friend.
Blair then undertook a series of visits around the world to try and build up support for Bush's planned war on terror. Sometimes he went where the president couldn't go. Blair was depicted as the president's international traveling salesman as he chalked up 40,000 air miles. But like other prime ministers, Blair felt that his influence in Washington depended on publicly supporting the president, both diplomatically and militarily.
One of the things that is said, former American Secretary of State said that in that moment of crisis, one of the elements in the special relationship, as far as America is concerned, is that Britain is prepared to send troops, to commit themselves to pay the blood price. I mean, do you recognise that?
Yes, I mean, what's important too is at that moment of crisis, they don't need to know simply that you're giving general expressions of support and sympathy. I mean, that's easy, frankly. They need to know you're prepared to commit, you're prepared to be there. And when the shooting starts, you're prepared to be there.
To bolster the American bombing campaign, Blair sent troops to Afghanistan. Royal Marines joined US Special Forces in the search for Al-Qaeda. Blair had helped persuade Bush to take one thing at a time in his war on terror. And as the Taliban fled from power, Blair's stance was applauded in the US. In Baghdad, President Bush's opposite number had been identified as the new target in the American war on terror. Bush said he wanted regime change in Iraq. The question was how and who would help him achieve it. Last September, Tony Blair arrived for a meeting with the president at Camp David. Whether they'd already agreed in secret, the date for a war with Iraq has been a matter of great contention ever since.
It's my honor to welcome the Prime Minister back to Camp David.
The point that I would emphasize to you is that the threat from Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, potentially nuclear weapons capability, that threat is real. The policy of inaction is not a policy we can responsibly subscribe to. So the purpose of our discussion today is to work out the right strategy for dealing with this, because deal with it we must.
That's why Americans must understand that when a tyrant like Saddam Hussein possesses weapons of mass destruction, it not only threatens the neighborhood in which he lives, it not only threatens the region, it can threaten the United States of America, or Great Britain for that matter. The battlefield has changed. We are in a new kind of war.
There were senior figures in all parts of the British system saying to me, Claire, it's already been decided there's a date.
Thank you all.
Blair gave his word to Bush very early on from the spring and said, we're with you. Yes, we've got to deal with Iraq. We'll be with you. And we're saying something different in his own country, to his own cabinet, party, parliament and people. And that's the big question, is that right?
No decision was taken to go to war against Iraq until the decision to go to war against Iraq was made in March of this year. And the rest is a matter of pretty public record.
But isn't this a semantic thing? Obviously, the actual decision to go to war was taken when it was, but a decision in principle to overthrow Saddam, to get rid of Saddam.
No, well, I don't think it is much more than a semantic issue, because the implication, perhaps not of your question, but of some other people's questions, some kind of Faustian pact developed between George Bush and our Prime Minister, which was then overrode the international and domestic political processes. Well, that's nonsense.
Blair helped persuade Bush to take Iraq to the UN. After weeks of haggling, the Security Council passed the deliberately ambiguous Resolution 1441 unanimously. It stopped short of explicitly authorizing the use of force, and there was a second prong to the Blair-Bush strategy. Over the summer, they'd agreed that the Prime Minister should publish an intelligence dossier to convince the public of the threat posed by Saddam and his weapons of mass destruction.
The thing that I regretted was somehow or other the debate went wrong in public. And we still suffer from this today, and all this hoo-ha about the dossier and weapons of mass destruction and 45 minutes and all that stuff. And I was always very, very skeptical about the utility of these dossiers, or Colin Powell rushing off to the United Nations to present a case, because we were saying implicitly, it's up to us to demonstrate to you this man is guilty. But the United Nations Security Council, in all its majesty and authority, had unanimously told the world at the end of 2002, he is guilty. He is in material breach. And somehow or other, the burden of proof shifted, and we found ourselves stuck in smoking gun territory, in scrabbling around in Iraq to try and find this stuff. I don't think that was right.
The closer the prospect of war with Iraq grew, the less convinced the public became of the reasons given by Blair and Bush. Over 1 million people turned out in the largest ever protest march in Britain that was deliberately routed past the street where Blair lived.
Say to Bush and Blair that we don't want your slaughter in the Middle East. We don't want your blood for oil.
Under extreme political pressure, Blair lobbied Bush into going for a second UN resolution that would authorize war on Iraq.
Clearly, there was greater interest on the British side of the ocean for going for a so-called second resolution than there was on the American side. There was more suspicion about it on the American side, but in this case, we were willing to go the extra mile in order to help take Prime Minister Blair's and others' political situations into account. At the end of the day, it didn't work because of the French, the Russians, and others, but again, I think what you have there is another example of American willingness to meet the British halfway and then some.
As the cartoonists lampooned Blair and Bush's shared vision, the second resolution was stillborn. And Blair agreed to embark on what Alistair Campbell, his then communications director, labelled the masochism strategy. The idea was that Blair would go on television to argue the case for war with members of the public. The more hostile, the better. 9 days later, Blair and Bush were at war. America's overwhelmingly superior firepower rapidly demolished the Iraqi dictatorship. The Americans suffered 138 losses, the British 32, although there were very many times more Iraqi deaths.
Back up! Back up!
But the aftermath in Baghdad has been bitter and bloody. There's been a rise in terrorism, which the war was supposed to curtail, and it's led to renewed questioning about Blair's true reasons for going to war. But Americans understand Blair's motivation.
The backdrop was what I believe is a correct strategic assessment by the Prime Minister of how Britain can maximize its influence in the world, which is as working as America's partner. I say that, if you will, to set him apart, say, from the leader of France, who clearly has a very different notion to how France can maximize its influence in the world. I think the British paradigm is correct, but there you have it. But I think in part it reflects Mr. Blair's strategic assessment. I think second, though, Iraq was something which was more than just politics. It had something to do with morality and a reading of international relations, a post 9/11 type decision. And I think for Prime Minister Blair, as it was for others, this was simply seen as something that was important and necessary and right to do. That it was one of the ways in which you help define the character of a period of history.
The war in Iraq had crystallized questions about Britain's relations to American military power. Blair's critics in his own party and in Europe claimed that he'd blinded himself to the true nature of the Bush administration and been seduced by a trigger-happy Texan.
I suppose the argument that's used, especially by many people in the Labour Party, is that here is a right-wing, hawkish, aggressive, unilateralist, ignorant president, and here is the British government cozying up to him.
Well, first of all, that's a parody of George Bush, and you need to, he's certainly right-wing, that's for sure, and we have to deal with governments as they are, but he doesn't justify the other adjectives, and it's what I say to these comrades is that they're making their policy on the basis of a false analysis if they think that this is a stupid administration which is insensitive and unintelligent. In any case, it's there. I didn't agree with the former Soviet Union, but it was there. I did think we ought to try and get as close as possible without in any way compromising our national interests. Now, I know what the parody is of the current US administration. I have to deal with it all the time. But if you actually judge an administration by what it has done, and not just by the noises off rhetoric, you will see there is an administration where it actually has been very committed to using the United Nations.
Blair actually said to America, I'm with you. You know, I'd prefer you to go to the UN. And once you say, I'm with you, come what may, you don't have any leverage. So I think the tragedy is that he could have had an enormous legacy and built on the historically close relationship between the US and the UK by saying, if you do this right, we'll be with you. And I do think, as Blair was kind of flattered by Bush, because obviously Bush needed him, Blair was saying, I can deliver Europe. And he would say things like, oh, I can have a word with Chirac about that, and I can talk to Schroeder. And he saw himself as sitting there with all these personal relationships and being able to just chat people up and fix it all. And in fact, it absolutely fell apart, and he went unconditionally with Bush and absolutely damaged his relationships in Europe very deeply.
The Bush-Blair relationship is regularly condemned in Britain and Europe as that of a puppet to a cowboy president. But across the Atlantic, Blair is seen very differently. As he arrived in Washington 2 months ago, Blair's view was that the combination of public support for the president and private advice had brought tangible results. The Blair camp claimed that Bush would not have been so committed to the roadmap for Middle East peace without the Prime Minister's influence. Blair's way with words and his ability to articulate the case for America was greatly appreciated both in Congress and in the White House.
Good afternoon. It is once again a pleasure to welcome the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and Cherie Blair to the White House. Mr. Prime Minister, fabulous speech. Congratulations.
But as Blair listened to the president's praise, he and his advisers knew that the case they had made for backing the American war against Iraq was coming under the closest scrutiny. The focus was on the intelligence dossiers, as well as Alastair Campbell's role in relation to them.
Of passion, of moral clarity.
And the day he left Washington, Blair knew that the continuing failure of the British and Americans to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was damaging him politically. The next day came news of David Kelly's death. Blair agreed that he would give evidence to the inquiry he'd immediately set up. And suddenly the whole question of the Prime Minister's own integrity and his true reasons for supporting America in Iraq had moved to center stage.
Right. Good morning, everyone. Since we last met, the news coverage, unsurprisingly, has been dominated by the Hutton inquiry and the continuing situation in Iraq. On the first, I would simply say, let the judge do the judging. I ask people to suspend their judgment until we hear his. That's what I intend to do.
Prime Minister, when I interviewed you last year, you accepted that one of the elements in the special relationship was that Britain sometimes had to pay the blood price. I just wonder, a year on, with the war in Iraq, the loss of life of British troops, the loss of trust in you, the loss of 2 cabinet ministers, the fractured relationship with your own party, and what's seen on the ground as a desperate mess in Iraq, what you feel now about the price that you have had to pay for your unflinching support of President George Bush?
Firstly, it's not the price I've paid. I mean, the price has been paid by British and American soldiers, by Iraqis. But you should also understand this. The reason that I supported the action in Iraq was not because I thought we simply had to support America. It's because I thought it was right. I still think it's right. I think the link between terrorism and rogue states with weapons of mass destruction is the crucial security threat of the 21st century. Now, I believe that. I'm not infallible in the judgments that I make. Of course I'm not. And there'll be other people who strongly disagree with that. But that's what I believe. And that's why I acted in the way that I acted. And I think that in the end, that's what you've got to do when you hold this position.
Tony Blair has committed our troops into action more often than any post-war British Prime Minister. He'd come to power saying that Britain could be the bridge between Europe and America. But his support for George Bush over Iraq has caused the biggest post-war rift between Britain and its key European allies. And the political price that Tony Blair is already paying for his devotion to the special relationship looks to be getting steeper every day.